We have some special guests here tonight, if you allow me to make special acknowledgement to New South Wales Shadow Ministers and Sophie Kotsis. Sophie is a long friend of mine, and I'm delighted she's here with us this evening. Jenny Atchison, Jenny, a fireball there in the Parliament. Love your work, Jenny. And the Shadow Minister for Education, Jihad Dib, is joining us as well. State Member of Parliament Joe Halen is with us. Yes. Elizabeth Scully, a candidate, one of our state Labour candidates. Also see Tara Moriarty here, a candidate for the upper house. Our party officials, Kayla Renee and Mark Lennon, are here. Representatives of the union movement, including Alex Klassen from the RTBU, are with us. So I'd like to thank all of you. And I know that there are many Labour Party members here. There are some of you who are not members, but are supporters. There are some of you who are here to see what tonight is all about. You are all welcome as our friends this evening, so thank you. Now, if I can just give you a quick glimpse of how we hope the evening flows. Shortly I'll be welcoming Julia to the stage. I'm going to engage in a conversation with her around 45 to 50 minutes. And then we have some questions from the audience. And I might just note that we have had an overwhelming response to this evening, as you can see from the room. And we had an overwhelming response to our request for people to put forward questions to ask the former Prime Minister. And quite frankly, I think we would be here till tomorrow morning. And as much as I might enjoy that, because then I don't have to go back to that fractious Senate, I don't think we're going to be able to accomplish that. So we've contacted some members of the audience who submitted some fantastic questions and asked them if they would be prepared to ask them. So when we get to that point, I'll be asking them to come down to the front. So I do apologize that not everyone will be able to ask a question, but we've simply just been quite overwhelmed by the response to this event. So with no further ado, let's move on to it. Ladies and gentlemen, it is an absolute delight for me to welcome someone who is a remarkable, historic leader for our country. Julia Gillard is, of course, the 27th Prime Minister of Australia. She continues to serve Australia and indeed the world, and may I say womankind, with great distinction now as the chairwoman of the Board of the Directors for Global Partnership for Education, the Honorary Visiting Professor at the University of Adelaide, a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution Centre for Universal Education, as the chairwoman of Beyond Blue, and of course as a visiting professor at King's College London, where she's joining the King's Policy Institute. And we will talk a bit about that work that she's doing there later. She's of course a companion of the Order of Australia and listed as one of BBC's 100 women in 2018. Ladies and gentlemen, she's our woman tonight. She is, of course, Julia Gillard, the 27th Prime Minister. Sydney. It's lovely for you to be here.
Thank you for turning on the weather.
Oh, yeah. It's always beautiful in Sydney, no matter what's happening outside. Well, but let's start with a bit of a rotational banter. Given what's happened in Victoria over the weekend, did that result surprise you? And do you agree that Victoria is Australia's most progressive state?
The magnitude of the result surprised me, not the fact that the government was returned, because it's been a great government, but the magnitude of the win. I think I could play into a whole lot of Victorian, New South Wales, Melbourne, Sydney stereotypes here, you know, Sydney siders out sailing, talking about business on a glittering harbour, Melburnians dressed in black in coffee shops, you know, debating existentialism and feminism. I could play into those stereotypes. But really, I think right across the country, here, Victoria, people are looking for governments that can navigate the future for them and that understand community issues and want to support communities along the way, and that's what Dan and the team offered, and I think that's what New South Wales Labor is offering.
Well, thank you. We look forward to taking the mantle of the most progressive state next March. All right, let's move on to some of the issues around women in politics. I want to spend a bit of time on this. I see there's a lot of women and young women here in the audience. Recently, I had the privilege of being at Parliament, Federal Parliament, when your official portrait was unveiled. And in describing it, you said you wanted it to be different than all the others because you are different to all our other prime ministers. As of course the first and still the only woman to hold the role. Now that I think is something to be marked and celebrated, but I also wondered, are there other ways you think you might be different to some of our previous prime ministers?
Yes, I think there are probably some other ways I'm different. I mean, we are happily a nation where we've proved time after time that it's possible for people to come from very ordinary families, indeed migrant families, go to government schools and end up being Prime Minister. So that's my journey. I think maybe one thing that's a little bit different is it's not something that I thought about when I was a young person, and perhaps it comes slightly back to gender in the sense that when I was growing up you didn't look up and see female role models who were leaders. You had a man who ran your state, you had a man who ran the nation, and so that was your image of leadership. So I was never that kid who was 7 years old or 9 years old going, I'm going to be Prime Minister. I suspect maybe a few of our Prime Ministers have been that kid.
It's funny you say that because the night you became Prime Minister, I was Premier of New South Wales and I was going to a school function at a Pyrmont Public School, and the school leaders all come out to welcome you, and that night all these little girls ran out. And they said, Miss, girls are in charge everywhere. And I thought, how amazing to be a 9-year-old and to look up and see your state and your nation, and of course with Clover Moore and Tanya Plibersek and pretty much anyone who represented you at any point, Governor and Governor General, was all female. So did you feel a sense of that when you were in the office, that perhaps there were 9-year-olds looking around?
I did feel it. I mean, I too visited a lot of schools, and they conspire, I think, the teachers to make sure that there were a number of girls who would greet me, and then they would select red-headed girls. And I visiting school after school, you'd have to get back in the car and go, this is statistically improbable that every school I go to, the school leaders are redheads, like something's going on here. But I certainly, thought the images of that time, for example, when the Queen visited and you had Quentin Bryce as the Governor-General, me as Prime Minister, then Katie Gallagher as ACT Minister, and we were the official greeting party on the tarmac in Canberra. I think that, was a special moment and created an image for girls about there are no locked doors, you can do anything. And a friend of mine whose son was quite young while I was Prime Minister told me a wonderful story about something on the TV that caught his attention, and he'd sort of raised it with her, and she was trying to have a little political conversation with him. He was about 5 or 6 then. And so, she ended up this little political conversation saying, well, if you're really interested in issues like this, you could be Prime Minister. To which he knowingly replied, oh no, you have to be a girl to do that. So we didn't, I didn't really want boys getting the impression that the Prime Ministership wasn't for them, but it did make me think, how many girls have sort of counted themselves out because they didn't see female role models, and at least you had the sense that was changing.
Now you said in your autobiography that, that sexism doesn't explain everything about your prime ministership, but it explains some things. And I think you might agree that one of those things is the way that a woman's appearance or her sexuality can be used to denigrate her political views. And in the last few weeks, we've had examples of that still happening. Scott Morrison came into some trouble for his comments about Pamela Anderson and her political views. We saw in the United States new Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez criticized because the jacket she was wearing was too nice for someone who was supposed to be representing the working class. Now, some of us might have hoped we'd have seen a decline in this type of behaviour. Do you think that this is going to keep happening for some time, and how do we respond to it?
I think it is going to keep happening for some time. At King's College, I now lead a Global Institute for Women's Leadership, so it's a research body. And we did some research comparing the media treatment of Prime Minister May in the first 2 weeks after she became Prime Minister, compared with Prime Minister Thatcher, who became Prime Minister in 1979. And we found that the coverage was actually more gendered now. Now, I don't think that our image of women leaders has gone backwards from the late 1970s to now, but certainly a thing that's changed is reporting and standards of respect towards politicians. And so now the media will report, you know, exactly what someone's wearing and criticise it. And this was all in the coverage about Prime Minister May, whether she was wearing kitten heels or what she'd chosen to carry as a handbag was all there, in a way that it wasn't about Prime Minister Thatcher, just because standards have changed. And so I fear that, you know, in this era of kind of, you know, quick media, that focusing on women's appearances will be something that makes easy and lazy stories. And it will only change when we as consumers are very demanding of change, and also when there are so many women that it just becomes kind of crazy. You know, women aren't the unusual person. They're just, you know, the cabinet's half-half. It's equally likely a Prime Minister or a Premier is a woman, and then I think we'll see it recede, but it's some time from where we are now. I decided when I, you know, sat for my portrait that I wanted to make it sort of a, you know, from there, so kind of big face, but wanted to do that deliberately because I wanted to take clothes out of the equation. So I didn't want the commentary, which was, you know, in my Prime Ministership, so much of the commentary was about what I was wearing. I didn't want the commentary about the portrait to also be on that. I wanted to deliberately put people's gaze elsewhere. And I think we should all be trying to find the ways of saying enough now with the appearance stuff. Let's get on with the, you know, real business. Is a female leader a good leader, a bad leader, right policies, wrong policies? That's the legitimate debate.
Now, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but you told a funny story when you unveiled the portrait about how much you did not like the idea of having to sit for a portrait. You kept putting it off and putting it off until one of your staff pointed out that maybe you'd want to do it while you were still somewhat for
any aspiring politicians in the audience. Lesson number one: always get staff who are frank and fearless with the advice. I had a staff member called Nina, and as she saw me equivocate about this portrait, she did come to me and say somewhat sternly, "You ought to get it done while you still look something like you did when you were Prime Minister, not a hell of a lot older." I'm like, okay then.
But it's a good point about it in terms of clothing as well, because if the focus had been on the clothing, unlike the men who are all in a suit, your clothing would have aged in a dated fashion way, and that's not what the focus should have been on. So
no, that's right. I mean, the benefit of the uniform that men have, I mean, and you can't, we've got to be sort of a little careful with the nuances here, because it's not like male politicians never get criticised for their appearance. I mean, you know, height, weight, we can think of the world leader whose hair is, you know, mentioned a lot, and he's a man. So, you know, there are criticisms that come in the way of male politicians for appearance, but clothing is essentially a uniform. And, you know, this came powerfully home to me when I took my first overseas trip as Prime Minister. I went to Afghanistan to see our troops who were fighting there. I went to Brussels to meet with the Secretary-General of NATO because we were fighting in a NATO auspiced format. And literally the first report of me walking into that meeting said, you know, Julia Gillard at the NATO headquarters meeting the Secretary-General wearing a white jacket and dark pants. And you think, you know, I wasn't at the Brownlow. I wasn't at the low list. I wasn't somewhere where, you know, you would price in that people are going to be very interested in what you're wearing. I was going in to talk about our strategy for a war.
Yeah.
And if you can't clear clothing and appearance out of that, you know, kind of crazy.
No, it is. Now, I'm thinking back to the time when you were in office. You mentioned, you know, that Katie Gallagher was there. You had 3 female premiers during your prime ministership. Me, Anna Bligh and Laura Giddings. I think Anna Bligh and I had the first caucus at COAG in the female bathroom. And now, to be fair, you know, both New South Wales and Queensland are now on to their 2nd female premier. But I think it's unlikely that we're going to see such a cluster prime minister and a number of premiers and chief ministers anytime in the future. You know, to those who despair about the decline of women in politics, say in the current government or in senior leadership positions at present, where do you see hope?
Oh, look, I see hope in the political journey that the Labor Party has been on. I mean, I'm of the generation that fought for the affirmative action rule in the 1990s that basically said, you know, we need change. And if you know, track that in the national parliament, when we adopted that rule in the early 1990s, both the Conservatives, the Liberal Party and us were around about 14%, 14% of our respective political parties were women in the national parliament. And we said this is going to change, affirmative action target, and here we are all these years later and Labor's been as high as 48%. And if we have a good election, next election, we will get to 50%. And the Liberals have inched their way forward to 23%. And we all know the kind of debates they are now having internally. And in fact, those debates now are getting out there very publicly about whether their political party has done the right thing by women or reached out to women. So, you know, when I can see that change in my years of involvement in the Labor Party, that gives me a great deal of hope about what else we're capable of doing.
Terrific. Now, we might, though, unfortunately, make a similar reflection about the international stage. I mean, Hillary Clinton, you know, lost to Donald Trump. Theresa May is actually battling right now to stay in office. Angela Merkel is likely to resign this year or into early next year. I mean, and it seems, it might be fair to say that the world seems almost gripped by what you might call a simple nostalgic, near nostalgic desire for some kind of paternalistic past, you know, where you've got simple answers to things like economic inequality, mass migration, climate change. You know, is it too easy to say that these are kind of inward, nostalgic, nationalistic tones are also driving down women's representation? Is there a link there or not?
Yeah, I do think there's a link, and I think, you know, around the world, the pace of change and some of the great inequalities that have come with the pace of change. And here in Australia, because we've got some things right, we've managed to moderate some of those inequalities. But the pace of change, the inequalities, I think has made people fearful, it's made them anxious, there is nostalgia, there is a sort of yearning for a strong man who might be able to just sort it all out. I think some of that fed into President Trump's election, and it certainly fed into various of the electoral contests in Europe. And whilst we're seeing that, you know, and seeing what's happening in our world, it can feel pretty negative. But I also see a huge wave of, you know, activist change, and that's the other side. And these things are contending. So yes, there's President Trump, but there's the women's marches, and there's Me Too, and there's more women running for the Congress in the US than ever before. And I think that is showing us that around the world there is a gathering activist movement that is looking for the next wave of change. And I genuinely believe when the history books are written about this period, it will be identified as another of the great feminist waves of change. And whilst you're in the middle of it, it all feels a bit incoherent and, you know, chaotic, and what's it all going to add up to? But I think that's how the waves always feel, and then they gather, and then the demand for change gets clearer, and then the change happens. I really think we are going to see that in the next few years. It gives me a lot of hope.
So is that what you took out of the recent elections in the United States? So, I think, I don't know if any of you've seen on social media, there was a great graphic of the Republicans who were elected, which were, I think, all but one white men, and the Democrats, who were this multicolored, multi-gendered mob. Do you see that as evidence that there might be some type of uprising, if I can use that word?
In a very peaceful way, peaceful and democratic way. Yes, I do. I think when communities are anxious, one narrative is hanker for the past, fear the other, people who don't look like you, people who don't worship the same God that you do. And the other narrative is to say, well, kind of we all come in different shapes, sizes, genders, ethnicities, sexuality, the whole diversity of the human kind, but we're all in this together. So what can we do together to shape a better future? And I think we are seeing those narratives contend around the world. And ultimately, I am a believer that the narrative that we are stronger when we come together and work together will win through. And I certainly think that a key driving force in that will be women, because they do look at the people who are selling the fear narrative, and overwhelmingly it's people who don't look like them and don't seem to understand their rights and perspectives, and in fact often challenging women's gains and women's rights as part of that backwards looking narrative. So I think there's a lot of energy around, actually. I'm very optimistic.
Let me ask you about women in power, because not women in power, but women and power, because if at any point where we have an uprising or not, or that we have moments or not, when women have to learn to wield power, women have to be comfortable wielding power in order to create this type of change. Now, you yourself have been in power. You interact with women like Theresa May and Hillary Clinton. Can you give the audience a sense of what were some of the pivotal moves you made on your way up through the political process that helped you define and position yourself and grow accustomed to exercising power?
Yeah, I think one of the great things about a Westminster system, and it seems to me there's a reason why it's more likely that women will come through in a Westminster system, and why it's harder, for example, to get a female president of the US, is the task of wielding power is ultimately one about fusing and collaborating with a team. You only get to be the leader of the Labor Party if the team that deals with you most intimately day after day after day, that sees you in your best moments and your worst moments, still says, that's the person we want to lead us. And I therefore think the journey through the sort of Westminster power structures, so you start as a backbencher, bright-eyed, and you want to learn, and you get your first shadow ministry, and then you maybe get a more senior shadow ministry, and then you keep working your way up. You get to develop and shape yourself as a leader through those experiences, and people get to see you tested. And if I wanted to point to, one thing on my journey, which I think was a pivotal moment, was after the Tampa election, when migration and refugee and asylum seeker issues had played such a major and destructive role for Labor in that election, and we were back in opposition, having had such high hopes of getting into government. And people were looking around for who's going to be in the shadow ministry and who's going to do what. I put my hand up to do what was regarded as the hardest job, which was the population and immigration job. And I think, looking back on my journey, that it was deciding to take that when no one else wanted it, and showing that you had the fortitude to try and do something that difficult that gained a lot of respect I wouldn't have otherwise had.
Well, I mentioned Hillary Clinton and Theresa May and that you and Angela Merkel and others that you've had, Jacinda Ardern, you've had the opportunity to get to know. This is a slightly lighter note question, but I remember a few years back there was a comedy sketch done by the Captain Kim crew. You're not in it, so it was called The Real Housewives of the World. Some of you might remember it. Featured Angela Merkel, Julie Bishop, Hillary Clinton, Helen Clark doing really typical female-y type things like shopping for power blazers on the side of the G20. I doubt very much, I don't know, that's what women leaders get up to, but can you give us a sense of is there a type of friendship or camaraderie that does develop amongst women who lead nations? I can reflect on my time as Premier. Being leader one alone is very lonely at times. But I can imagine being a female leader of a nation at times must be incredibly lonely. There must be a sense of some type of understanding.
Yeah, no, there is. I mean, I went to a number of meetings, G20 meetings in particular, where there were other women there. Angela Merkel, for example, Kristina Keneally, who leads the IMF, and there was coming together of the women. I mean, we would talk in particular about what it was like to be a female leader. There was a natural gathering together. Yes, you would all be hitting the bathrooms at the same time because, there's breaking proceedings at the G20 and that's your moment to go to the bathroom and do all of those kinds of things. So yes, we would sort of be in there together, and there was a very sort of natural sense of affinity, and I very much valued that. And of course I went to one major meeting, APEC, which brings together economies that account for more than half of the world's economic activity, and I was the only woman leader at that meeting. So you could see both sides of the coin, what it felt like to be when you were absolutely there by yourself, what it felt like to be there when there were other women around. And I think at that international level, it really is, it's a slightly different dynamic because people are coming from different cultures, different language groups, different ethnicities, but it's a reflection of the dynamics in a parliament or in a cabinet, which is if you're by yourself or there are very few women, then the dynamic will be different than if there is a critical mass of women.
And so you have to navigate the meeting quite differently. Your strategies are probably a bit different.
Yes, strategy is a bit different. You're, sort of the visible oddity. The APEC meeting I'm talking about was actually in Hawaii, and people, so it was brought together by President Obama, and people would probably remember that APEC is the one where you come out in the funny shirts at the end, and that can be a moment in a whole lot of ways, and for a day and a half I had President Obama joking, don't worry, we've got it all organised, grass skirt, coconut bra, for that.
But with him, that was just for the record, that was clearly a joke.
Oh, no,
you seem to have a very friendly relationship with President Obama.
Yes, absolutely. Clearly a joke, and it was received as a joke, and yes, we did and continue to have a good relationship. When I sat down and wrote my book, I joked about something special about 1961 kids, because I was born in 1961, he was born in 1961, and I also got on very well with Prime Minister John Key from New Zealand, who's another 1961 kid. A good year.
It was. Now, I want to turn to a few things that have happened since you've left office, and ask you to reflect on them. A lot of things have changed since you left office 5 years ago. Some for the better, some perhaps not so much. But I would say, inarguably, the biggest social change in Australia has been the change in legislation to legalise same-sex marriage. And that was as a result of that resounding yes vote in the plebiscite. Now, when you were in office, you were opposed to changing the law. And to be fair, so were many other MPs and many in the wider community. But what do you think the points were that shifted Australia's views on marriage equality, and did your thinking shift, and why?
Well, I was sort of on taking a different lens to this than many others. I was there obviously for National Conference when the major demand for change was around civil unions, and I thought that perhaps there was, and this is the 1970s feminist movement, perhaps there was something very interesting to explore about creating a different way of looking at people solemnising their unions for same-sex couples, for heterosexual couples, and having you know, the option of that very traditional marriage with the religious heritage to it, but having a different way of looking at people making commitments through civil unions. And so I was very interested in that. Obviously, as the campaign started over time, the demand for marriage equality became a demand around changing the Marriage Act and same-sex marriage. And looking at the journey now, I think, one, it is an unbelievable victory for community campaigning, fantastic. Two, it builds a bit of trust into the fact that there are better angels in the community. I was very anxious about the plebiscite. I was very anxious that, you know, you would see all sorts of very nasty campaigning. And whilst I'm sure that there are marriage equality campaigners who did face nasty incidents, overall the sense in the community I thought was a very sort of accepting and open one, and that ultimately showed in the vote. So for me, you know, over the journey, I recognise that yes, I had this view about civil unions, but that wasn't where the campaigning was. And so when it came to plebiscite time, I very proudly voted yes.
It was an extraordinary shift, and can you think of anything in your experience that the community shifted so quickly?
I think, look, I think in many ways that's the most dramatic shift we've seen in a short period of time, not just here, but around the world. I wouldn't in many ways want to be seen to be comparing other changes to it because it was such a dramatic and important shift. But looking at my time in politics, I felt that the change around how we think about disability, whilst you know, quieter than that very visible marriage equality campaigning, that we did as a nation shift around disability, and that's what made the National Disability Insurance Scheme possible. And that I could go to events where you would be looking out at an audience that was full of people with disabilities and their family and carers and loved ones, and that community got as campaign active as it did to show to Australians that it was a community prepared to put itself right out there for change. I thought that was part of a still changing view that we need to change more, but a changing view about how we think about people with disabilities. And then, you know, you see things like the Invictus Games and that shifts it some more.
I agree. And while the NDIS, you know, a tremendous achievement by your government, and one of those historic legacies that you will, I think, ever stand in as for you as our Prime Minister. Your time in office was also marked by a singular economic event, global financial crisis, both as deputy and then later on as Prime Minister. Your government and Labor and government was able to steer Australia through the GFC without veering into a recession. And you know, now Australia has been lauded for its economic success, and I'm just wondering, during your time as you look around the globe, we are now struggling here in Australia and globally with the aftermath. You know, and we've got rising economic inequality, taxation and legal systems that have been used by the wealthy to privilege themselves at the expense of working people. Where do you see in the world where countries are managing this the aftermath of the GFC well, and what are the risks for Australia?
I think when we look around the world, when the global financial crisis was happening, it was so hard to explain to people what was going on in the global economy. I mean, just a very, it seemed so intuitively hard to explain that, a crisis in a mortgage market, subprime crisis in the US could start this global contagion, and then there's sovereign debt, and then people are talking about countries going bankrupt, and then people are talking about banks falling over. It was hard to explain it to people, so there was a lot of fear around in Australia. And when people emerged from that fear, because we didn't have a recession, I think it was hard for people to appreciate just how bad it could have got if the government hadn't made a series of very important decisions about guaranteeing the banks and economic stimulus. And, I pay absolute tribute to Kevin Rudd and to Wayne Swan for, being there in the epicentre of those days and for making some of those big calls and making them very quickly and getting them right. I think when we compare that with other countries around the world, we've got a lot to be proud of. And many places that I travel to now are still emerging from austerity politics where, the cutbacks to health and education, to people's living standards, to people's prospects of a job have just been terrible. And you can see the consequences of the youth generation that came of age in the aftermath of the global financial crisis. And, the statistics are very clear on this. If you have the bad luck to come of age when there's a big economic downturn and you don't get your foot on the first rung of the employment ladder, then that disadvantage can show decades and decades later. And you see that in Europe, you see it in the faces of young people who have missed out and don't really have a prospect for hope. So I do think there's still a lot to be proud of here. That doesn't mean that there's nothing to do. There is inequality in Australia that needs to be combated, rising inequality. Wayne Swan's written very persuasively about this. There is the need to reassure working people that they're going to see a fair reward and fair return for their labour, and the fact that wages have been pretty slow growth, pretty stagnant for a long period of time, obviously has undermined that faith in people. And then there's a lot to do in education, in investing for the future, climate change, all of those big picture issues, which at the end of the day all come together as to whether or not we can truly say as a generation that the generation that comes after us and the generation after that are going to have the ability to lead better lives than we do. And, that ultimately I think is what people judge on and think about. The aim of each generation is to say, my children, the next generation, should get to lead a better life than I did. And so there's, still some big picture questions out there, and that's what the forthcoming elections will be about.
One of the strengths, I would argue, of Australian democracy that aided us both in terms of the GFC and aided us in dealing with some of these questions is compulsory voting, as well as an independent electoral commission that draws boundaries, and compulsory preferential voting, which means votes don't go to waste. But do you see, one, I don't know if you agree with that, but two, do you see threats to Australian democracy, apathy, nationalism, Trumpism, or something else?
I think compulsory voting is an incredibly important and precious thing. And, I used to... I used to wander around my electorate come voting day, and you'd go to the polling booths, and sometimes there'd be queues and people would have to wait 10 or 15 minutes, and people would be grumbling, and I'd be saying to them, heavens above them, and around the world people fight and die for the right to vote. I mean, you can't stand in queue eating a sausage sandwich for 10 minutes like, behave yourself. So really, a lot of tough love got dispensed in Lawler, but people munching their sausage in bread with the onions on top would then acknowledge that perhaps they were being a little bit silly and it wasn't that hard to stand in queue. So compulsory voting is a really important thing. And I spend a lot of time in the US now between one thing and another. And if we look at things like their gun laws and their inability to respond to mass shootings compared with what our nation did under John Howard's leadership, but with Kim Beazley as opposition leader, what our nation did in the wake of Port Arthur, compulsory voting gave us political space to address that issue, whereas when it's about voluntary voting and money and bringing out motivated voters, it means it runs in the direction of the National Documents Association. So compulsory voting is so important. But that doesn't mean we're untouched by democratic challenges. And, I think here and around the world, the acceleration of media because of new technology, the new way we get information now, the fact the media cycle is kind of 15 minutes, nothing can get sort of dug into depth, that people end up in communities where they only hear in their bubble views that are from people a bit like them, that I think is troubling. And I think it makes it harder to build a consensus around big changes. So I do think we've got to talk about that more and explore it more and try and find a sort of new democratic rhythm that gets more information that is credible and is dealing with facts into people's hands than what we've managed now, where shrill voices can really, pull debates around, and we saw that with carbon pricing and the climate change debate.
Well, I know we're pressed for time, and I'd love to unpack that a bit more, but I want to spend a few more moments before we go to audience questions on education, which you were the nation's education minister, and I know it's a passion of yours, both when you were in office and the work you're doing now. I recently had the opportunity, though, to host a conversation like this with Thomas Frank, the American political analyst, who's written books like What's Wrong with Kansas and Listen, Liberal. He's a severe critic of conservatives, but he's also a critic of what many might describe as progressive or centre-left politics that put such an emphasis on education as a great opportunity leveler and a way to ensure that people get ahead in life. He says if by doing that we're almost blaming people because they didn't get education for their own failures, and that we really ought to also be contemplating that a well-rounded society is offering jobs for people who don't want or aren't capable of achieving a higher level of education. And I'm sure you're familiar with Frank's critique, and do you have a response to that?
I do, and I think there's some force in the critique. I wouldn't take it to the extent that he does, but I think there's some force in the critique. That because we wanted to see the opening up of more opportunities for university, and I certainly wanted to see that as Education Minister and Prime Minister. And at an earlier stage of Australia's history, I benefited from that. I mean, I was in school when Gough Whitlam abolished upfront fees and made it possible for a kid like me to go to university. So this whole question about whether you could get to go wasn't sort of theoretical or arcane for me. I mean, the Whitlam government came in and abolished the fees, and I went to university, and maybe I could have got a Commonwealth scholarship under the old system, or maybe my parents could have flogged themselves even more and worked even harder, but it would have been very, very difficult for me to get there without the Whitlam reforms. And so, in our narrative as a Labor Party, we've put a lot of emphasis on opening up access to university, recognising that the jobs of tomorrow were going to require higher and higher skill levels. But that doesn't mean that we ever forgot about other pathways to success, including, of course, vocational education, training and apprenticeship opportunities, and all of those other ways that people find work that matters to them, that gives them dignity, gives them a purpose in life, gives them an income. So, you know, I think the message always has to be, there's not one way to live your life, and there's, in the modern world, not one life to live. You know, you'll end up doing something for part of your life, and then something else, and then something different, and you'll go back for a bit of retraining, and all of those things are good opportunities. Yes, there will be some people who say, I don't want any of it, and I'm content doing, very manual work, or work that doesn't require an education qualification. But we do need to be very practical. The percentage those jobs are of the future economy is a very small percentage. And we can't lock ourselves into a system that sees large numbers of people competing for what will be a very limited number of jobs.
What about your work with the Global Partnership for Education? Because it's working in a very different space. It's looking to get an education system in the poorest nations and particularly focus on girls. What changes when a girl in a poor nation gets an education?
Well, the answer in one word is everything. And the countries we're talking about are countries where at the moment there would be kids of school age who don't ever go to school at all, where for many, if they do get to go, completing primary school will be the highest level of education they ever attain. And the face of the child who's most likely to miss out on schooling at all is the face of a girl, a marginalised girl often living in a rural area. And what her life will consist of is, staying at home, domestic duties, caring for other children, perhaps subsistence, agriculture, perhaps helping take goods to market, whilst others in the family, the boys, get to go to school. And yet we know that if we can get that girl an opportunity, that an educated girl becomes a woman who's more likely to marry later. That is, she's more likely to choose when and who she marries rather than being a child bride. She will choose to have fewer children. Her children will be more likely to survive infanthood, more likely to be vaccinated, more likely to go to school themselves. And so you get on this upward cycle of development. So it's about empowering that woman, but then it makes a difference for the next generation and the generations beyond. And when you see it absolutely happen and meet the girls that it's happened for, it's just magic. So incredibly heartwarming to hear stories about how much they wanted to be educated, how much they were prepared to dedicate themselves to doing it, walking an hour and a half each way to get to school each day, prepared to do it 3 hours walking to go to school, and yet they were so focused on getting that future for themselves, they did it. And if they're prepared to show that much courage and fortitude, then I think the world kind of needs to step in and say, well, if you're prepared to do that, the very least we can do is make sure that there's a quality school for you to walk through to go to school.
It must be so rewarding. I'm very much enjoy about your post-politics life. Now, if you'll forgive me for a moment, a bit of a fangirl question. I understand that Rihanna is an ambassador. She is for GPE. For my mother-in-law, who's here somewhere, that feels she's a pop singer. Sorry, Karen. I'm sure that there are a few people in the audience. I actually can't name them. But I do have teenage sons. So just between us and my teenage sons, what is she really like?
Rihanna, she deliberately decided that she'd use her unbelievable celebrity power to support education, and particularly to support the Global Partnership for Education. I've been honest enough with her for her to have no expectation about me knowing her songs. She knows that I wasn't a fan or anything like that. But I am a fan of the work that she's done to raise the profile of education. I did travel with her in Malawi, and we went to a number of schools, and she just loved it, diving in and out of classrooms, talking to kids. We went to a girls' high school where it was just you know, a wave of girls running out of classrooms to see her and meet her, and they're singing her songs. And, you know, they're in Malawi and they knew who she was and every word to the songs. And she herself is just good fun. We were wandering around this primary school, which was, you know, village constructed many years ago, mud bricks, dirt floors, and, you know, Rihanna was running in and out of classrooms talking to kids. I was walking with the school principal, and I'd sort of lost sight of her, but I knew she was around, and as we're walking past her classroom, I'm making conversation with the principal, and she's saying, oh, you know, this classroom's very old, the village built it in 1963. So I said, you know, oh, that classroom's almost as old as I am. And then Rihanna was running past going, don't be telling us your secrets, girlfriend. Which I thought was very cute. The school principal looked a bit quizzical, as it happened. Very cute.
Fantastic. Now, just before we go to the audience questions, we're about to two quick ones, last ones from me, a bit of fun ones. One, what are you reading right now, and would you recommend it?
I have been reading some absolute rubbish, I'd have to say.
I'm tempted to ask if you're reading the Australian. No, did to the Australian writers here, I'm really deeply, not kidding.
I came back from overseas about a week ago and read something so rubbishy on the way back that I can't even remember the title. You know, you just get to that moment in a long haul flight where it's either a really rubbishy book or a really rubbishy movie. So I watched a lot of really rubbishy movies, and I do find on flights you get more emotionally engaged with them. I don't know if it's because you're so tired.
I cried during Les Mis on a flight, the one with Russell Crowe in it. And there
was reason to cry with Russell Crowe singing on it.
You know, Russell Crowe is watching. I'm very deeply sorry.
Yeah, I didn't mean that, Russell. I can top that. I watched the Planet of the Apes series.
You didn't cry.
Caesar in the last one. Oh my God, this, you know, this fictional ape. Anyway, sorry, I'm getting sniffy about a fictional ape. But the last book I read, I would recommend if you're looking for a work of fiction. Jane Harper, an Australian author who writes murder mysteries, but she's written a book called The Lost Man that's set in the outback, and I think if you're looking for a summertime read, very good book.
Oh, terrific. All right, well, there you go. We've had a book recommendation, and if you haven't seen Planet of the Apes, which I haven't.
Sorry about that.
Okay.
Spoiler.
All right. She dies in the end.
Yeah, you've got to get to the third movie, or maybe it's the fourth movie today.
All right, I think we better move to questions to the audience before I have to apologize to anyone else. I'm going to insult on the stage. Do we have our questions from the audience? Here we go. All right, coming across. For those, yes, thank you.
Former Prime Minister Gillard, I wondered if you could tell us what you consider to be the greatest legacy of your Prime Ministership.
I always hate it when people say, you know, name the greatest, because...
I thought there was 8.
Because you get to do so many things in different areas. Look, I'm enormously proud of the NDIS. I'm enormously proud of our education reforms. I'm hugely proud of the work of the Royal Commission. Also, you know, very pleased that we made some big foreign policy moves, strengthened our alliance with the US, whilst at the same time we secured some new diplomatic arrangements with China. So right across the board, there are things that I'm very proud of. And one of the great delights now post-politics is, you know, as I move around Australia, people do come up and tell me a story about how some of the things we did have made a difference for them, and that's always, you know, incredibly heartwarming to hear, you know, the practicalities of the NDIS, the difference it made for someone to tell their story about how they were abused and for the first time they believe, you know, a school that's different because of the funding reforms we brought and the quality reforms. So all of that still gladdens my heart.
Thank you for being the best Prime Minister in the last decade.
Thank you.
Julia, it's an honour to be here with you tonight.
Thank you.
In my parents' generation, the politically defining moments were things like Martin Luther King, I Have a Dream, and JFK, Ich bin Berliner. For me, it was your misogyny speech. It's still there on Facebook, and I always watch it and I always share it. But I've always wondered, was that prepared or was it off the cuff?
The speech was off the cuff, so I think you can kind of see that. What happened was, I knew question time, or thought question time, would be about sexism, because it was a speech given in a political context. You know, the speaker that I had supported, Peter Slipper, had been shown to have sent very sexist text messages, and so I thought I would go to a question time where I would be asked questions to try and make me look like a hypocrite on sexism. And so I did ask my office to get together for me, you know, sort of Tony Abbott's top 10 sexist statements. Which they put together very quickly. Of the jobs I asked him to do as Prime Minister, that wasn't, you know, amongst the hardest. And so I had those quotes with me, and then as I walked into the Parliament and, you know, should have been the Leader of the Opposition first question, he instead moved a motion which started the debate. And so when he spoke, I just wrote down in my very dreadful writing some handwritten notes to guide me, and then gave the speech off that. And in the original edition of my story, the book I wrote, Post-Politics, when you open up the cover, the sort of inside wash is those notes, which you probably thought was some form of kooky design, because my handwriting's so bad, but they are actually the notes from the misogyny speech. A staff member of mine had the wit to scoop them up at the end of question time and to keep them, so we do still have them.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Hi, Julia. My question is, at what age is it appropriate to introduce my daughter into politics? Because I want one day my daughter to be like you. Or...
I mean, I think, you know, at the end of the day, politics is about values, and, you know, we try and teach kids values from the very first moments that they can understand, and that we can model good behaviours to them, whether that be about, you know, sharing toys or any of the simple things that we try and persuade children to do. Now, I don't underestimate the difficulty of persuading children to do that. I get to spend some time with my great niece and great nephew now. They're very well behaved kids, but, you know, sharing favourite toys, these can be challenging concepts when you're 5 and 3. So I think if you're modelling good values, then as children get older, the political discussions are then built around putting those values into action. And that was really, you know, my sort of journey. I came from a great family, a great home. You know, our parents not only modelled good values to us, lived out those values, but as my sister and I got older, they would talk about what, in their view, those values meant at a local level, a state level and a national level in terms of politics. And so that helped me join the dots between, you know, doing what you should do to be nice to your classmate sitting next to you in school, to join it to what should we do as a nation to make sure that we're creating the best future for everyone.
Can I, well, we're waiting for the next questioner to come up. I'm listening to you, and my parents did the same, talk to me about politics at the dinner table. But I'm wondering, do you have an earliest political memory? Like my husband talks about, he was barely alive for the dismissal, but he remembers people talking, about it. My earliest memory is of Nixon resigning. It was actually the earliest thing I can remember, watching the president get on that helicopter. I wonder if you have an earliest political memory.
Yeah, I mean, we talked a lot about, political issues around the dinner table, but my, first real political memory is the dismissal of the Whitlam government. I was in about second year high school, and we were on an excursion that day. We'd gone to a local aged care facility, and we were interviewing, residents who lived there. So each of us talking to a resident, getting their life story, and then we're supposed to write it up as a little living history sort of exercise. And I distinctly remember this sort of, frisson going through the teachers that had taken us for the excursion and the staff of the aged care facility, and then looking anxious and talking to each other and picking something up that something big had happened with the government. And the aged care facility we went to was actually closer to my home than the school was, and so they let those of us who were in that position just go home at the end of the exercise rather than go back to school and then go home. And so I just walked down the street to my house, and because my dad worked shifts, he was there that afternoon with the radio blaring to get the news from Canberra, and the sense that your nation was kind of really on the edge. I remember that really clearly.
Oh, hello, Julia. My particular interest is mental health, and I notice that you're doing work in that area at the moment. One of the key things that I see with people when they're recovering from problems with mental health is affordable housing and meaningful employment. What do you think we can do in those areas to improve outcomes?
That's a great question, and I do now chair Beyond Blue, which is a fantastic organisation, and under Jeff Hennett's leadership has done so much to remove stigma, and now we engage in service innovation. So Beyond Blue doing a lot of great work. And at Beyond Blue, we often talk about how, while services are really, really important, how a lot of mental health is actually resolved outside the consulting room, in places where people work and live and learn and play, and we need to be talking about those things too. And so, we do know that it is very protective of people's mental health and very supportive of recovery if people have something meaningful to do. Now that might be paid work, it might be something else, but a purpose. And people have a safe place to live. So the areas you raise are pivotal. And I'm not sure that we're as good as we should be at joining those dots. One thing that I think will help us is that there is a Productivity Commission inquiry now into mental health, and I think that will help us join some dots in workplaces and attitudes towards mental health and employment. And then looking at forthcoming political debates. Of course, we know that Tanya Plibersek, Deputy Labor leader, great Sydney person, one of her passions is affordable housing, and one of the reasons for that is that she's joined these dots about how important it is for mental health. So one to watch, I think, as the campaigns next year unfold.
Hi, Julia.
Hi.
My question is, with all the hate and bile thrown at you by Tony Abbott and his crew, Did you ever feel your job was just too hard, or did that behaviour make you dig in and be determined that these people wouldn't get the better of you?
Look, it wouldn't be honest of me to say it never hurt. I think I was, and I think I continue to be, pretty good at separating my sort of own sense of self from the hurly-burly of the political debate. And I worked on that consciously. It's something I thought about. I'd watched the experience of others before I was senior in politics, including some of the women who ended up having fairly senior roles. And I did see that you could let all of this really get in your head, that you could be a politician who was literally, kind of bright-eyed and, jaunty on a day of good headlines and sort of, round-shouldered and inward-looking on a day of bad headlines, that you could make your sense of self very hostage to this media cycle. And I made a very deliberate decision that I wouldn't do that, I was the same person on both days and I would deal with the media, but I wouldn't let it get in my head quite that way. And I'm glad I made that decision, because by the time I was Prime Minister, of course, it wasn't just the swings and roundabouts of the traditional media, but some of the vile stuff that circulates on social media, truly vile, particularly for women. But even with that, being quite clinical about it, yes, there are times that it, hurt and you felt the burden of it, but never to the extent that I felt demotivated. I was fairly quick in the recovery. I do joke, maybe half joke, that Reuben the dog has heard my best lines for many years now, the absolutely unfiltered reactions. Fortunately, he's not telling anybody, so they're safe with him. But if you do let off that little bit of steam, then I think it helps you to then, manage the rest of your reactions.
Can I follow that up? Because you talk in your book, My Story, about the sense of purpose and having a purpose statement. In fact, you say you went back to it at times to remind yourself in those moments. Yeah, that's something I imagine we could all do. We don't have to be politicians to write out purpose in life and to reflect upon it. Is that something that came to you as part of politics, where you just felt you had to be clear every day about what your purpose was because of all the things being tossed at you?
Yeah, I actually sat down and wrote out my, purpose as Prime Minister and the purpose of the government I led. As a result of receiving that as a piece of advice. Alan Milburn, who became a bit of a campaign consultant to Australian Labor, but had served as a cabinet minister in one of Tony Blair's governments, he actually said to me when I became Prime Minister, look, I know you know what you believe in and what you've come to do, but write it out, it'll crystallise your thinking and you'll always have it with you, and politics can really buffet you around, so you'll have it with you. And I did do that, and I did have a written out document about the sense of purpose I had that I kept with me, and it would steady me on the days when the weight of it did feel like it was very heavy on your shoulders. And I agree with you, that's not an exercise that's just of meaning to politicians. I think that that's an exercise that's of meaning to everybody trying to navigate their life. What is it that you really, really want to do and want to achieve, and how can you anchor yourself in that even on days when pressures are coming at you at 1,000,000 miles an hour from all directions.
Miss Gillard. One of the most significant achievements during your government was the design and implementation of the National Disability Insurance Scheme. The NDIS has made a significant difference in the lives of hundreds of thousands of Australian families, like my own, in assisting them to more easily and affordably access the care and support services that they need. As with any government program of this size, such as the online census and the My Health record, there will be issues with the implementation. My question is that aside from these implementation issues, have you received any feedback, positive or perhaps negative, from the families and the recipients of the NCIS? DIS, sorry.
Yeah, thank you. I'm very glad you raised this because it's one of the constant frustrations, I think, of the reporting of major developments versus their lived experience. Inevitably, in big reforms, there will be, time will be needed, administrative decisions will be taken. It won't all be smooth sailing. And it's too easy, I think, for the media attention to go on a few implementation issues and then say, oh, the whole reform's wrong, rather than say, no, the direction of travel's right, the reform's right, but any big reform has got a few implementation issues. And we accept that from, private companies and corporations that, when they're doing something big, that often there's an error rate and then it gets ironed out. So the way you put it is very important, I think, for people to understand. I haven't had people come up to me on the implementation issues. I've had people come up to me on the difference it's made for them, how they're looking forward to it making more difference, so that they've recognised that it's going to take some time to settle, and they've recognised that it's going to take some time for them to become the really discerning, empowered, client who's really tailoring the supports that they get. And to hear those stories and to see people, have the power in their hands to be the, actors and drivers of their own life story, the way we all want to be the actors and drivers of our own life story. That to me has just proven that the reform is absolutely right for Australia and for people with disabilities and those who love and care for them.
Julia, this is the second half of the question I wanted to ask you. I hope you can answer it. What was the funniest thing that happened to you in Parliament or during your time in politics?
Lots of genuinely stupid things happened along the way. Right at the start, when I was first elected in 1998, on the morning that I'm going to give my first speech in the Parliament, my mother's travelled up to Canberra for it. I've got local campaign volunteers, friends who've supported me across my sort of political journey. One of the things that's less remembered now is it took me, once I decided I wanted to be in Parliament, it took me a decade to get there. I was rejected for pre-selection 3 times and then I didn't get elected in a Senate election. So, by the time I got there to the House of Representatives, this was a big moment. And getting ready that day in Canberra, the hairdryer I'm using actually blew up so badly that it shot flame out of the front of it. And I reacted quickly enough that all of my hair wasn't on fire, so that was a win. But I did have just sopping wet hair, and what am I going to do now? So I trudged round to where my mother was staying and used the hotel room hairdryer in her hotel. So, stupid incident to start with. And then if I was picking a stupid, actually I can do another hair story. Now my hair stories, I'll do one more. When President Obama was here in Australia, we travelled to Darwin together to do a series of things. Darwin, hot, humid, doing a series of things there. And I was explaining to him and his team, look, it's going to be really hot, it's going to be really humid. And President Obama was like, I used to live in Indonesia, I know about hot and humid, and the team was displaying this great degree of confidence. We all know about hot and humid. And so I'm trying to say, well, my hair will go into ringlets, I'll look like a poodle, like I'm talking about really hot and humid. And we get to a sort of big, sort of hut thing that had been constructed for President Obama to give a major speech to troops, to Australian troops, and they tried to air condition it and it hadn't worked and it was just hot as hell in there. And President Obama's giving the speech and all the rest of it, gets to the end and he's shaking hands and, you know, lots of applause, and then one of his Secret Service faints because of the heat. And I'm like, I was trying to tell you guys, like, when we say hot and humid, we kind of really mean really hot and really humid. And then to cover up this moment, President Obama, gracious enough to not say, like, you know, guys, why is the team fainting? Just called to his lead Secret Service guy, we've got to get out of here before Julia's hair goes frizzy, let's go. I'll come in handy. And then my last day in the Federal Parliament, if the truth be told, on the final night I was Prime Minister, may have had a drink or two, may have been up till quite late in the night with a few people, including Wayne Swan. Then no one told us that Parliament had been adjourned till midday, so we got into the Parliament just before 9, just in case division bells went, and then went, oh, you know, like I really could have done with a few more hours sleep. And then we're told, okay, you'll need to go to question time, you've all got seats at the back now, you'll know where they are because just look for Dick Adams, and Dick Adams was a Labor member from Tasmania, a very big man, so we thought, what can possibly go wrong? We'll just walk in and we'll head for Dick Adams. So Wayne and I walk in, and I've got Craig Emerson with me and Peter Garrett with me, we're all looking for our seats, we're all looking for Dick Adams. And of course, Dick is late for question time. So we're just miscellaneously wandering around the back row, thinking, where will we sit? And then someone came and rescued us, and I'm not entirely sure to this day whether we got to the right seats, but everybody overlooked it. So some of the stupidest things that happen, and some of the highs and lows of federal politics.
Mm-hmm. Well, this has been a real high for us tonight. Julia Gillard, thank you so much for spending time.
Hello, my name is Kate